Motherhood, but not quite as we imagine. Thought-provoking, refreshing, straightforward, sometimes taboo, often seemingly ordinary, but always honest. Welcome to School for Mothers, opening conversations we all need to have, exploring ways in which you can be fulfilled as a woman, once a mother. Now, here is your host, mother of 10, Danusha Melina Durban.
Hello and welcome to this episode. I'm Danusha Melina Durban, your host. And today, I thought I'd bring you an introduction to my latest book. This one follows hot on the heels of my last one on motherhood. Noise, a manifesto modernising motherhood, was published spring 2021. And I've received so many endorsements and emails about it that I'm truly humbled. I mean, The Telegraph, for instance, called it a complete debrief of motherhood, and it was hailed as revealing the inside of the madness and opportunities of layering on roles, including, but in no way limited to, household, childcare, and professional responsibilities. Of course, all with little additional support from society, corporations, or government. It starts with how society, then we, that's women, construct our motherhood identity, mother identity, and it is zip to do with that archaic idea of having it all. Noise upended taken for granted ideas about what it takes to be a good mother. It's not written as a white woman's motherhood Bible either. That's good. And it blew apart aspects of motherhood that women are fed that we must feel or do. Now, this is important so that we can build out our own version of being a mother. And because it also integrates pieces of my life story as a mum of 10, I cannot begin to tell you how cathartic it was to write. Let's be honest, it was painful, joyful, and pretty exposing. I don't hold back. For instance, I get loads of emails from readers, and one of the most commented on sections is about the letter I wrote to my older children. It's published exactly as I sent it, unedited. It felt terrifying to share this because it's not your average love letter to your kids. It's a sit up and get real ode to myself as a human, which obviously puts a bomb under the self-sacrificial model of being a mother. Now, Noise is quietly, literally almost sold out on Amazon, and a second edition is apparently needed pretty soon. SPUNK, a manifesto modernising fatherhood, my new book, is out at the end of May. Oh my goodness, I'm so excited. Pre-orders are in the usual places like Amazon, etc. Now, if you told me that less than a year after completing Noise, I'd be writing a book on fatherhood, honestly, listeners, I'd have howled with laughter and exhaustion. Now, days away from this next book coming out, I can honestly tell you I believe sharing about men as fathers is more than critical for everyone's progress, including our kids. We must understand why fatherhood is where it's at, in a host of ways, for different men. We need fathers now more than ever, just not the ones we have. Now, listeners, I'm going to share with you the intro to SPUNK. It'll give you an idea of why I had to write this book. It'll also tell you why I wrote a book called SPUNK. Here goes then. Introduction and a note on SPUNK. It's fair to say a lot has been happening in the world of fatherhood in recent times, as a new world order unfolds in which stereotypical and traditional understandings of roles are reimagined and executed. An evident preoccupation with mothers is easily traced to a necessary overcorrection following decades in which women, especially mothers, were not taken seriously. Even now, I'd argue mothers are almost exclusively considered in relation to their ability to serve the interests of others. Having partially corrected the historical invisibility of women and mothers through a host of media formats, books, TV, and academic studies, for instance, it's obvious that conversations, research, and policies must include fathers in them as full partners, rather than have them relegated as pseudo afterthoughts. In other words, fathers must not be left out. If you disagree, this book is not for you. Spunk is written as part of an emergent challenge to fathers being at the sideline. It came about because of my experience as a mother and my examination of taken-for-granted assumptions about motherhood itself. Being a mother of 10 children spread across decades affords me enormous experience and time to consider the inside of what it means to be a mother from the structural locations I occupy. Now, this culminated in the publication of Noise, a manifesto modernising motherhood, 2021. Part memoir, part analytic intersectional critique, addressing the many ways societal thinking about motherhood, identity, and the treatment of mothers needs a radical overhaul. The journey of crafting Noise is inextricably linked to this book on fatherhood. In my motherhood manifesto, I unpack 6 culturally significant pillars that scaffold motherhood globally. In taking apart what I call the mother stopper culture, I could critically analyse the central question: how can I be a mother and still be me? I began researching motherhood years ago as a tenured business school academic, but it was when I started hosting the School for Mothers podcast in 2018 that I began hearing the same recurring themes over and over from accomplished guests. These themes stopped them in their tracks or threatened their chances of realising their full potential. 1 year on, I decided to host the School for Fathers podcast, which turned out to be a significant spur for writing the book you're now reading. Before I even started recording podcast interviews with fathers, I was met with questions about who the new host would be. Once people were told it would be me, I was asked why I talk with men about fatherhood and whether I expected men to speak with me candidly, since I'm a woman. The topic brought a mixture of cynical disbelief and serious intensification of fixed beliefs about what's possible between men and women, especially about fatherhood. I felt a heavy tinge of mocking underlying these comments, as if fatherhood was something to be sneered at. This mini groundswell of questions, consternation and discomfort didn't put me off. If anything, I was galvanised to hear fathers all the more. I'd realised, in listening to women as mothers in the previous year on the SFM show, that change, in its broadest sense, couldn't happen without hearing from men as fathers. My agenda in hosting both podcasts was firmly about change for the better for human beings, not only for those who happen to be mothers. In Noise, I wrote, how do we imagine that our children are going to inhabit a different kind of world if we do not give them a context within which to have that world? We say we want it, that different world, but we don't know how to get it. So we get little chunks of it, but we need to do something different. I don't have all the answers. I do have the conviction that we, mothers, fathers, parents, all of us, can be the agents of social change our children need. Time and again, questions about motherhood are really questions about fatherhood. Through hosting the School for Fathers podcast, I kept hearing about a hyper-normalisation of inhumanity to men as fathers. It seemed that while motherhood routinely features in media conversation for good and bad, in research communities and policy consideration, fathers occupy a contradictory space. Fathers talked about as central steadying figures in family life. At the same time, they seem to experience a degradation of purpose in wider society. My interviews unearthed dynamic, shifting and plural fatherhood identities. Men talk to me about constricting versions of masculinity, fatherhood and work, and the subsequent price for trying to live up to these. As uplifting and popular as the SFF interviews are, I spent hundreds of hours hearing men's choked voices tell me about their sadness at leaving their children, the effects of witnessing motherhood's toll on women they love, not having anywhere to express their vulnerability, and all trying to learn ways to undo years of emotional paralysis and numbness, succumbing to and beating addictions, and dealing with their own father wounds. Most mention the job of growing up, taking responsibility for themselves and their choices while simultaneously raising children they love. Naturally, they also talk of joy, love, accomplishment, lust, and pride. But I couldn't ignore the stark and urgent voices of these modern fathers about what fatherhood is for them, what's missing in ways to support fathers, and what's needed as better futures are built. SPUNK brings together fathers' voices, data from brand new empirical research on modern fatherhood, and advice for building much-needed father inclusivity. It's an urgent task to set things right with and for fathers, and it's one that must be done. I'm delighted you want to find out more and are joining me in exploring modern fatherhood from fresh perspectives. Side note, if you are expecting personal insights about my own father relationships, one bio, one adopted, here's the point where I advise you'll find very little. The reason simply being these men don't represent a diverse or unique enough sample of what fatherhood can, should, or might look like. In conducting the SFF interviews and the research for this book, there were thoughts, ideas, and themes that far surpassed anything I could add from my own experiences of fathers and fatherhood, both my own and my children's. These took precedence in the following chapters. Before I go any further, though, I want to mention why this book is called SPUNK. Being convent educated, I couldn't have quite anticipated how often I'd be using this word with its many colourful meanings. That may be its magic. So from an etymological perspective, spunk, a noun, derives from 1530s a spark, Scottish from Gaelic spong, tinder, pith, sponge, from Latin spongia. The sense of courage, pluck, mettle is first attested in 1773. A similar sense evolution took place in cognate Irish spunk, sponge, tinder, spark, courage, spunk. But it's also commonly known as a vulgar slang sense of seminal fluid, recorded from circa 1888. Now, linguistically, a tripwire surrounds this word because as much as it has roots in courage and determination and gumption, especially in American English, the British English, seminal fluid, semen meaning seems to have taken over British minds. And the minds of many, globally. Interestingly, many of the other meanings, e.g., a spark, a match, a lively person, seem to be more rooted in northern UK dialects and may not have had much currency in the south when this semen meaning took off. Spunk, of course, is also used now as a verb meaning to ejaculate. The synonyms for spunk ignore these vulgar meanings and include instead backbone, constancy, fortitude and grit, with an antonym of spinelessness. And while we're here, let's take a quick look at 3 recent examples from online news sources to see current usage of the word. And just like that is missing the funk and the spunk. Now that's from the magazine Rolling Stones, and it actually refers to the sequel to Sex and the City. Another one is from Kent Summers about a basketball game analysis, and he says, is this the point at which the sons are patted on their heads, complimented for their spunk, and sent along their way into the off-season? And finally, the family in the Tender Bar reminded me of the feisty Eldund clan in David O. Russell's The Fighter, minus a lot of the tornado unleashed indoors energy that made them seem so alive. Still, there are glimpses of that same kind of spunk here, as when Dad, aka The Voice, comes over the radio and someone hastily shoves the device off a shelf. Now that's in Variety, and it's about the film adaptation of Pulitzer-winning journalist J.R. Moehringer's memoir. Now, why I called this book Spunk so I could write about contemporary fatherhood is honestly manifold. I've got to confess, on a simple level, it made me kind of wince, snigger. Yeah, it's juvenile. I get it. If only the word weren't so ugly. I mean, I know, really, I do. It sounds like a bad thing, except it's not. I'm certain of it. It's all too easy to mistake discomfort for disdain or disinterest. So I started to explore. First, I thought about having spunk, courage, mettle, and constancy. As a child, I'd heard my parents talking about the need for people, aka men, to have this thing called backbone. Yet, when we look closely at social constructions of masculinity, we see they're kind of treated as this uniform category in which men appear to have been afraid of not measuring up to some vaguely defined notions of what it means to be a man. This anxiety revolves explicitly around fear of being seen as less than manly, as weak, timid, frightened, which struck me as an excellent place to look, as it appears in direct opposition to spunk. By defining masculinity in opposition to femininity, which doesn't demand spunk in the same ways, men try to invoke their own version of spunk and gather control to ground a secure sense of masculinity. I'll delve into rigid and essentialist masculine ideals in the next chapter. For now, the overall valorization of what Scourfield calls the essentially competitive character of hegemonic masculinity means I'm using spunk here to disrupt what's considered spunky for fathers. Second, and obviously, vernacular or slang use of the word is about sperm. The first person to study sperm in detail was Anton van Leeuwenhoek. I may have said his name wrong. In fact, I'm sure I have. He's a Dutchman who developed the early compound microscope. He first used his new tool to examine other subjects such as lake water, bees and human lice in the mid-1670s. Colleagues urged him to turn his lens to semen, but he was worried it would be indecent to write about semen and sexual intercourse, so he didn't rush to address the topic publicly. Finally, in 1677, he surrendered and examined his own ejaculate. He found himself trying to answer the most basic questions. Are sperm parasites or living animals? Does each sperm contain a tiny, preformed adult human curled up inside? Yes, really, that was an early thought of how babies are made. In 1677, he wrote to the Royal Society of London about his discoveries, saying, "If your lordship should consider that these observations may disgust or scandalise the learned, I earnestly beg your lordship to regard them as private and to publish or destroy them as your lordship sees fit." The president of the Royal Society, his lordship, opted to publish his findings in the journal Philosophical Transactions in 1678, and the brand new field of sperm biology was born. Current day of evolutionary sperm biologist Scott Pitnick tells us, every decent scientist I know has this dogma-busting streak. And so you always have your eyes out for something that doesn't make any sense, that doesn't jive with prevailing theory. Despite substantial advances in infertility research and all the solutions in this area, as I write, sperm research has been unable to develop effective, reliable male birth control. Even though everything from gels to pills has been tried, progress remains elusive. As Daniel Johnston, the chief of the contraceptive research branch, shares, sperm are fascinating, there is nothing like them. A sentiment originally unleashed in a much-quoted Monty Python musical sketch in the Meaning of Life film. This satire about Catholic teachings on reproduction forbidding masturbation and contraception declared every sperm is sacred, every sperm is great. It was said to be the sequence on which director Terry Jones spent most of the film budget. The song was later co-opted by anti-cloning and anti-abortion activists for demonstrations. Pitnick, who has spent more than a quarter of a century studying sperm biology, says, "We understand almost nothing about sperm function, what sperm do." He goes on to point out that many of the answers to these unknowns likely hide within the other half of sperm's puzzle, female bodies. Which brings me full circle to the beginnings of this book through the route of writing about motherhood identity. New understandings of fatherhood happen when we break open simplistic gendered notions of mothering as providing full-service nurturing and fathering as providing sperm, spunk, and playful fun. Hence, my use of the word isn't one bit to reassert any traditional notion or usage of spunk. It's to interrogate critically what kind of spunk do modern fathers now need? How do fathers with this spunk raise their children? From a place of subversion and reinvention of the word, I believe a new version of spunk is possible for men as fathers. This book will tell you how. Listeners, I believe fathers are simultaneously stunted by outdated structures, while held tight to fixed notions of manhood, leaving their man-us in something of a hot mess. Spunk, a manifesto modernising fatherhood, is a pragmatic tell-all of why fathers behave in the ways they do, and a problem-solving roadmap for the kind of fatherhood men are already shooting for, but struggling to grasp. The kind of fatherhood our children yearn for and deserve. I truly hope you enjoyed hearing what Spunk is about, and maybe it whets your appetite for more. Let me know what you think, won't you? Spunk is available in the usual places, everyone. Thanks for joining me. Sending you loads of love.
Thank you for tuning in to the School for Mothers podcast. To continue the conversation and keep your dose of inspiration up, head over to schoolformothers.com/podcast, where you'll find bonus content from Danusha and her guests on habits, recommendations, books, best apps, time-saving secrets, life hacks, health, sleep and anything in between. That's schoolformothers.com/podcast.